All right, so we are talking about our new book. This is the new book. If everybody has a copy of that, Saint Peter versus St. Paul, and it's by Michael Goulder. And as we begin this morning, I'm going to share a brief prayer here that comes from St. Paul. This is actually from Ephesians chapter 1. And so this will be our invitation to God's presence as we talk and learn more together today. I pray that the God of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of glory, may give you a spirit of wisdom and revelation as you come to know him, so that with the eyes of your heart enlightened, you may know what is the hope to which he has called you, what are the riches of his glorious inheritance among the saints, and what is the immeasurable greatness of his power for us who believe, according to the working of his great power. Amen. And that would be my prayer for our class this morning as we come to know Jesus better through our discussions. So I don't have anybody's picture up on my screen, so I can read my slides. Jane or Dennis, whoever's available, if you could kind of help watch for questions or people raising hands, and then just stop me when I need to pause for a moment and let somebody else talk. So this is a picture of our author. His name is Michael Douglas Goulder. He looks kind of quirky, like an academic might be expected. His collar is up, his hair is a little bit messy, and he's the kind of person I probably would like a lot, just because he's got some nerdiness to him. But he's the one that wrote the book. And as I did with the introduction to the Armstrong book about what we know about God or what we believe about God, I think it's good to begin with a little background on the author. That helps us to understand what his life's work was, what kind of a theologian he was, maybe what some of his biases were, and probably will help to inform us about what he wrote as we go along, if we kind of understand the background a little bit there. So who was Michael Douglas Goulder? He passed away in 2010. I think this book was written in the 1990s, so kind of like the Armstrong book, it's been around for a while. He was a theologian. He taught at the University of Birmingham, not Alabama, but in the UK, and retired from there in 1994. He had been an ordained Catholic priest until 1981, and then by some avenue that I don't know what happened, he became an atheist. But at some point along the line, he decided to go down that pathway. And I thought that was an interesting parallel to what we learned about Armstrong with the last text that we studied, because she had been a nun and then kind of ended up being a sort of a Buddhist agnostic as a result of her experiences with organized religion. So kind of a similarity there between the two. Goulder was an expert in both Old and New Testament scripture. That is unusual in academic theology. Typically, a scholar will choose one or the other and will be an expert on the New Testament or an expert on the Old Testament. But it's very unusual that you find someone who has enough of a knowledge base to be able to claim that they are expert on both parts of the Bible. His particular area of interest was in what academics would refer to as the synaptic problem. The synaptic problem is the questions that theologians have about where did Matthew, Mark, and Luke get their information about the life of Jesus and the ministry of Jesus. What were their sources? And so he's one who tried in his career to answer that question. And some of the answers that he came up with were a little bit different than the mainstream. We know for sure, or we think we know for sure, that both Matthew and Luke used the book of Mark as source material. There's enough similarities between Mark and Matthew and Mark and Luke to say with reasonable assurance that they both had access to Mark. And so that was kind of the skeleton or the foundation for the books that they wrote that have ended up in our New Testament. There's another hypothesized source, and we've talked about this before, But a lot of scholars think that there was some other source that we haven't discovered, and they call it the Q source, or it stands for Quelle, which I think is a German word. And Goulder was particularly interested in this. He actually did his PhD dissertation at Oxford on discounting the possibility of the Q source. He doesn't think that there was another source. What he thinks is that Matthew and Luke had Mark as a reference, and then they kind of wrote the rest. They made the story around what they had gotten out of Mark. So he discounts the possibility of any Q source coming into play here. A lot of scholars will not agree with that. Dennis emailed to the instructors, to the teachers this week, a retort, I guess, from another academic who disagreed with Goulder and does not accept his conclusions about what the sources were, as well as some other things that Goulder believed about the New Testament. But right or wrong, that's just who he was. That's kind of the way that he studied and understood the New Testament to be. And one area of, I guess you call it a subspecialty or something that he was interested in, he was very interested in the opposition between Paul, the Apostle Paul, and the church back at Jerusalem. So Paul ministering in Asia Minor and all the way over to Rome. And then there were the Jewish Christians who stayed back in Jerusalem. And we'll talk about who they were. And this was just something that Goulder wanted to know more about, so he wrote about it. And if you look at the title of the book, I noted it's St. Paul versus St. Peter, as if they're immediately, even in the title, he's talking about the conflict between the two. It's not St. Paul and St. Peter, it's St. Paul versus St. Peter. So there is a short introduction to the text, if you had an opportunity to read that. Goulder talks about something called the virgin church theory, and this came from a second century theologian whose name was Hegesippus of Jerusalem. He lived somewhere in the area from 110 to 180 CE. And based on other records, scholars have concluded that he wrote a lot of stuff. Most of it was lost, but there were a few bits of his work that had been retained. And so I think that's where this kind of theory first came from. Hegesippus was sort of an orthodox mainstream kind of person. He opposed some of the early church heresies that had to be dealt with, the Gnosticism and the heretic Marcion. We've talked about all of that in church history. But he kind of identified the first, he was one of the first proponents of what has come to be known as the virgin church theory. So what is that? Somebody want to tell me what's the virgin church theory? It has nothing to do with Mary, the virgin.
So maybe the church itself was free of conflict.
Yeah, exactly. That is precisely what the virgin church theory is, that the very early Christian church, the house churches in Jerusalem, and including the missionary work of Paul and others into Asia Minor, everybody was on board with the same set of beliefs and practices. And Goulder would say that's not true. There was conflict in the church from the very beginning. And this idea that everybody was on the same page and practicing the same way and believing the same thing was not correct. The church did have the witness of the early disciples, so there were presumably people who lived beyond the time of Jesus, and their stories were out there. They were sharing what they had seen and heard Jesus say and do. But at some point, even in this very early development of Christianity, there were people, Paul and others identify them as false witnesses or Judaizers. So obviously they're complaining about the people in Jerusalem, if they were Judaizers, who corrupted a lot of the early beliefs. And so that's what we're going to explore in this book. And so the author's perspective, there never was a single united church. There were two missions or two I guess you could say, denominations. Christianity was something that grew out of the message of Jesus, but immediately there was not one denomination of Christianity, there were two. So what were those two? What were the two missions? It ought to be a pretty easy question because it's in the title.
Well, St. Paul had the Gentile mission, and then the Jewish, if you want to call them Christians, Jewish Christian group in Galilee and Jerusalem.
Okay, absolutely correct. So we had the Jerusalem church early on that was led by Peter and James and John, the sons of Zebedee. And then later on, James and Jude, who are believed to be the brothers of Jesus, became prominent in the Jerusalem church. And then we have Paul the Apostle and the Gentile church, which went all the way over from Eastern Asia Minor to present-day Italy. Some people think Paul made it as far as Spain. I'm not sure that's ever been proven one way or another. So these two groups, the Jerusalem church and the Pauline group, if we can call them that, agreed on one thing, and that was that Jesus was a significant person, prophet, son of God, something. Jesus' message and what Jesus did was important. And what Goulder says is they disagreed on everything else. They disagreed on the validity of the Bible, and I'm sure they're talking about the Old Testament there because the New Testament didn't exist at that time. And so there was disagreement as to how much of the Old Testament really needed to be observed in the life of good Christians. They disagreed on whether God's kingdom had arrived or if that was something that they were still waiting for. Goulder says they disagreed on sex. I'm not sure how you disagree on that, but Paul was believed to have been celibate, and so I'm thinking maybe it's sort of a reference to him choosing because he felt that it was very close to the time of the coming of God's kingdom that everybody needed to be getting prepared for that, and so there was no time for getting married and making children and so forth. They had disagreements on what money should be used for. They had disagreement on the role of works. Of course, the Jerusalem church favored following the Old Testament and doing their mitzvot, doing their good deeds and doing works, whereas Paul preached extensively about having faith as the mechanism by which we come into a relationship with Christ. They disagreed about tongues. I think Paul accepted the gift of tongues and visions. I'm not sure that the Jerusalem church necessarily did. They disagreed about whether healings were actually possible. Apparently, they disagreed about Jesus' divinity. And I think that was probably from Paul because I'm not I think Paul probably believed more toward the divinity of Jesus because of the way that he experienced Jesus in a vision. Whereas I'm not sure that the Jerusalem church had actually gotten to the point that they looked upon him as the Son of God. And then there were differences in their beliefs about resurrection. Paul believed in a spiritual resurrection, and that's pretty well outlined in some of his letters, whereas the Jerusalem church, I think, accepted more of a physical resurrection. So lots of disagreements early on. Now, the author says, I don't just want to say these things. I want you to know why I think what I think. And so here are the some of the academic tools that I used to come up with this. He said, I'm trying to observe and follow the principle of coherence. And so he's taking all of his information from the New Testament as well as other sources that have been established as credible or believed to be credible by scholars. He's not taking wild stories or things that are, kind of questionable from the Gnostics or anybody else. But he's saying, I'm sticking to just trying to use things that everybody can agree on. He said, one of the basis of my conclusions is what he calls a loyalty test. And by reading what different people wrote in the New Testament, whether it's the Gospels or Peter or James or any other book that is attributed to one of these early church leaders, look at what they were sympathetic to. You can see in their writing what their biases were, and so he's using that as a means of kind of drawing some conclusions. And then finally, he uses something that he calls the emphatic negative. Sometimes accusations in the New Testament, especially accusations toward what Paul was doing, are not explicitly stated. You can look in Peter and you can look in James, and they don't, there's nothing written in there about that, that dastardly Paul guy. He's telling people that they don't need to be circumcised and they don't need to eat kosher food and so forth. But if Paul denies that, if he speaks to the negative about it, then the assumption has to be that the other side has said it explicitly somewhere, even if we don't have it recorded. So if Paul says Gentile males don't need to be circumcised, even though we don't have any writings from the Jerusalem church that says otherwise, we can assume that they must have made that argument to be required of all Christian males. Does that make sense? Anybody have questions about that?
I have a question, Paul.
Sure.
When he talked about, I think it was in the intro, when he said that he didn't go to outside sources, he said something like the what did he call it? The Neo-Thomas or Proto-Thomas.
Yeah.
Is that the Gospel of Thomas that he was talking about, or is that something
Well,
else?
I think there's more than one Thomas. I think there's the book of Thomas that we've kind of become somewhat familiar with. And then I think there are additional texts that, are existent, either have been discovered since that time or were not deemed to be accurate enough to be included in the canon of Scripture back in the 4th century CE or BCE.
I guess I was confused. He says that he only goes to, written sources for his opinions, but then he didn't go to a source like the Gospel of Thomas to interpret that.
Well, I think that's what he's trying to say is the strength of his argument. He's trying to stick to what we have in the New Testament without bringing in other books that probably people don't know for sure are reliable references, partly because they were written later. A lot of those were written after Matthew, Mark, and Luke and John, so probably in the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD. But and I don't know. I think he's, there's in science we have lots of tools we can use. We have all kinds of instruments to measure things. In theology and in history, sometimes you're limited in what you can really hang your hat on as being proven or accurate. So the best you can do is to try to stick to some tried and true sources. So I think maybe for the purposes of trying to convince other scholars who didn't think the way that he did, he was trying to use the texts and the references that they would use. I don't know if that's
I have a question.
The answer. Yeah.
This book written before or after he became an atheist?
Well, he left the priesthood in 1981, and I don't know the answer to that. This was published, I think, in 1994. So I kind of feel like maybe he's already made that journey, but I don't know. I don't want to make any guesses, and they're not correct.
That would be my guess.
There's some really good New Testament scholars who are atheists. Bart Ehrman is another one that I have read some of his books and listened to some of his videos. He was a born-again Christian and then kind of, I think he started out as a conservative Christian. I think he was Methodist or something, and then became a born-again Christian in college, and then, went back and got his doctorate in theology. And at some point along the line, he's very good at theology. He just doesn't have any religious belief to go along with it anymore. So that happens. All right. So here's just an example of the disagreement. I pulled a couple of passages of scriptures that came to my mind. In James, the brother of Jesus, presumably the author, you see that a person is justified by works and not by faith alone. And that's contradictory to what Paul wrote to the Galatians when he said a person is justified not by the works of the law, but through faith in Jesus Christ. And so this was very early. This was probably in the 50s, 50s AD that Paul wrote. I'm not sure when James was written, but you can see the nature of the disagreement there. All right. Another challenge is that Goulder identifies is that it can be difficult to pair up the writings of Paul and the letters of Paul with what happened with the Gospels, and not just in the Gospels, but also with the book of Acts. First of all, he says the book of Acts is not always in agreement about what happened with what Paul wrote. There are some differences in the story. Here's one example. So this is from Mark, from one of the Gospels. Jesus taught the disciples that all food was clean and fit for conception. That's Mark chapter 7, verses 15 through 19. And yet, in the book of Acts, presumably written by Luke or a follower of Luke, Peter has to have a vision to show him that all things are clean. And yet Peter was one of the ones who would have been with Jesus and heard him say that. So, where did that little disagreement or misunderstanding come from? And then Paul gets upset with Peter because Peter comes to visit, and they go out to some Gentile markets to get lunch, and Peter won't eat the non-kosher meat that they purchase at the market. That's Galatians 2:12. And so why is there this disagreement of the facts, if you will, between Jesus talking to the disciples and explaining that, it's okay to eat other food, and yet Peter clearly is struggling with that somehow. Goulder also refers to the book of Acts of the Apostles as a doubtful asset. Why does he say that? And any takers on this one?
Well, I think he thinks Luke is trying to bridge between the two, kind of harmonize or make peace between the two missions or factions, and he has to stretch some things to make it jive, I guess is what I would say.
Once again, you're absolutely correct, Dennis. He said that Luke actually was the inventor, maybe not of the Virgin Church theory, but he was the inventor of the idea that, as you said, the early church was in harmony on a lot of things. And so Luke tries very hard to present a picture that the early church is getting along and not having any of these issues that Goulder says that they were having. Goulder notes about himself. He says, I know I'm on the radical end of the spectrum, but his thought, not my thought, his thought is that each gospel writer has reinterpreted Jesus in line with their own theology. And that's especially true in the book of John, which is markedly different from the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And that includes some of the things that Jesus may or may not have said. How hard is it to take a story, let's say a story about Jesus, and reinterpret that story in line with what we believe? Do you think the gospel writers were out of line if they indeed did do that? Do we ever do that? Do we ever interpret scripture in light of our own glasses that we're wearing, whether they're rose-colored or any other color?
Well, I think everyone has some interpretation of their own, but these guys were all writing. I say they were all writing, but I think they were writing to different audiences, which required a little different presentation anyway, because of who was hearing what they had to say.
That's a great point. I hadn't thought about that, but that probably plays a big role in it as well. Anyone else?
Which was the author? Was it Mark or was it Luke that Amy Jill Levine was teaching us that he framed what Jesus said, but he framed it completely different than what Jesus actually said? I think that was Mark.
That was Luke.
Oh, it was Luke. Okay. I was just really shocked when I went back and read the scriptures and I saw how he introduced the scripture, and then the story did not really say what he said it said.
Yeah, that was her criticism of Luke, was that he was not only sure, he'd say what the parable was, but then he'd interpret it for the reader, and she didn't think
Right.
that was very fair.
And he did appear to interpret it wrong, at least.
Well,
when you
according
look
to
at
her,
it,
yeah.
Yeah, according to her.
Yeah, according to her Jewish perspective, he didn't always understand, the Jewish mind. So,
Well,
all right,
I was going to say, stepping away from the people back in that time, I think our author, being an atheist, actually will help him not be biased to some of this too, because bias runs through everything if we're not careful.
Yeah, and that's also a good point I hadn't thought of. All right, so the main thing with this is, I think as we move forward, let's just keep in mind what the author's perspectives are. They may not agree with everything that we think or believe. They certainly didn't agree with the author who wrote the paper that Dennis shared with the instructors and who was very critical of Goulder. But that's kind of the way it is in the academic world. Sometimes there are differences of thought, and I think it's healthy to listen to all of them and then kind of let them kind of shape our reasoning and our own thinking, hopefully in a good way.
Hey, Paul.
Yes.
One thing that I picked up in some of the criticisms of Goulder by other scholars was they really appreciated his comments because he made them hone their arguments, even though they were, opposed to what he had said. They had to think harder in arguing against him, and they appreciated that, him bringing that perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I think he's pretty meticulous in his arguments. I'm not knowledgeable enough to agree or disagree with a lot of what he says, but I appreciate that he seems to have good arguments, and it's not just random thoughts. Here's what I think. This is what I think because I have some reasoning here that supports what I'm saying. Well, anyway, so we have the Apostle Paul's policy. I think Goulder calls it a liberal policy. And Paul thinks that the Gentile converts should keep the moral commandments, but are not obligated to keep the ceremonial laws. What's the difference between moral commandments and ceremonial laws? Maybe somebody can give us an example.
Keeping kosher.
Okay. So is that a moral commandment or a ceremonial law?
I consider it ceremonial myself.
I would too. Anybody else? Other examples?
Thou shalt not kill. A moral commandment.
Okay, so a lot of the 10 commandments are on the moral side of things. Okay.
Circumcision was a big one that was ceremonial, that the Gentiles wouldn't have joined if they had to do it.
Yep.
Well, also anything that's more traditional to that group would be considered more ceremonial, I would think, rather than moral.
Okay. Yeah, so I think we could look through a lot of the Mosaic law and find things that maybe were moral in their origin, but in the day-to-day practice of things that people did, took on this sort of a ceremonial appearance or nature. All right. So the problem, especially with Paul saying that the Gentiles didn't have to be circumcised or they didn't have to eat kosher food, led to the Jerusalem church sending representatives, what Paul he calls them spies. He said they came to spy on what the non-Jewish members were doing or not doing. And that is from the 2nd chapter of Galatians. And so in that case, they were having an argument over the kosher meat laws. And so I've pulled some of those scriptures out, and I want you to read along with me these passages from Galatians 2:1-4, kind of with new eyes and new ears, thinking about our author's thesis that there was conflict in the church. And see, I've highlighted it for you, so it's a little bit easier. But see if any of these statements from Paul sound like somebody who's having a little tiff with somebody. So Paul says, after 14 years, I went to Jerusalem with Barnabas. I took Titus with me, and I went up in response to a revelation. And then I laid before them, though only in a private meeting with the acknowledged leaders. Okay, so a little bit of a dig maybe that the leaders were acknowledged, but Paul doesn't really agree that they have the moral authority maybe to be leaders of the church. And he laid before them the gospel that he proclaimed among the Gentiles in order to make sure that I was not running or had not run in vain. So he's saying, I gave them my argument. I wanted to make sure I wasn't off on the wrong track and was wasting my time. So that's why, we're having this meeting. And even Titus, who was with me, was not compelled to be circumcised. The Jewish church didn't demand it at that time because he was a Greek. But because of the false believers who were secretly brought in, who slipped in to spy on the freedom we have in Christ Jesus so that they might enslave us. And so Paul is making this really strong accusation here that what the Jerusalem church is doing and what the Jerusalem church is asking for is like putting them back into slavery. Why is he talking about slavery? Why that analogy? What are they being asked to be slave to?
All the Jewish laws?
Yeah, absolutely. The Mosaic law. Paul wrote a lot about that, how we've been freed from the law because of Christ. And now he's saying the people from Jerusalem are coming back and saying, you have to embrace these practices, and that's just like putting us back into slavery. So that's a pretty powerful statement. I mean, you can imagine a lawyer in a court of law making statements like that. That would probably get some attention. And so from those who are to be the acknowledged leaders again, what they actually were makes no difference to me. So Paul is basically saying, I don't care if you think you are the leader, it doesn't matter to me. God doesn't show any partiality. These leaders contributed nothing to me. On the contrary, when they saw that I had been entrusted with the gospel for the uncircumcised, just as Peter had been entrusted with the gospel for the circumcised. So Paul's not making any friends here. These statements are probably going to be very offensive to, if the Jerusalem church read them, they're probably not going to be very happy with him. And when James and Cephas is Peter, and John, who were acknowledged pillars, recognized the grace that had been given to me, I have the grace, they gave to Barnabas and me the right hand of fellowship. So he's saying, we had an agreement. We shook on it. We shook hands on it, agreeing that we should go to the Gentiles and they to the circumcised. And they asked only one thing, that we remember the poor, which was actually something I was eager to do. So apparently, according to Paul, the original agreement between him and the Jerusalem leaders was that he could go preach his gospel, and the only thing that they demanded of him was that he would take up a collection along the way and bring it back to Jerusalem to share with the poor Christians in Jerusalem, which, if you'll remember, we did read about that when we studied Paul. So, and he says, we shook on this. We had a gentleman's agreement. But when Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he stood self-condemned. For until certain people came from James, certain people were the spies. James was, one of the leaders. Peter, he used to eat with the Gentiles, but after they came, he drew back and kept himself separate for fear of the circumcision faction. And the other Jews joined him in this hypocrisy, so that even Barnabas was led astray by their hypocrisy. So Peter had agreed, he'd had this vision. He'd heard Jesus tell him all things were clean, and so he was going to eat dinner with the Gentiles. But when the people from the home church came, Peter kind of backs off, and all of a sudden now he's a good pious Jew again, eating kosher, and Paul's calling him a hypocrite. So Paul was very angry. He felt the Gentile church was being excommunicated by the Jewish church. What do you think could have been the possible outcome from all of this? What might have happened to Christianity? We're talking about just maybe 20 years after Jesus. Is it possible that Christianity might not have survived? What do you think?
At least not as we know it now.
Okay, anyone else?
It was
Well,
a
it's
gossamer
interesting.
thread.
Sorry, there was two people talking and I didn't hear it. Jane, did you have something?
Yeah, does that, Nadine, what'd you say?
I just said it's a gossamer thread, just to find survival, but strong.
Yeah, I guess, I keep thinking if it had split and the Jewish Christians, as we might call them, they might have just gone more back into the Jewish faith. But I'm not sure, because Catholics all say that the rock of their religion is Peter. So I'm kind of confused by this argument. I think that this author is saying it was a big split between Paul and Peter, but at least later church leaders really didn't see that.
Yeah.
So,
Well, that's a good point too. So we know that in Catholicism, the papacy traces its heritage back to Peter as the first bishop of Rome. But along comes Martin Luther, and who did Martin Luther appeal to as far as opinions for the theology that he formed? Paul, yeah. So we still have that same butting heads between Peter and Paul 14 centuries later when Martin Luther comes along.
yeah, I thought this book was going to be about Protestantism versus Catholicism. So I was confused by this first chapter.
Well, it certainly could be taken that way, and maybe we'll get into that. I haven't read the whole book, so I don't know.
Yeah.
So what was the outcome? What did happen? Where did the thrust of the early Christian church, which direction did it go? Did it go primarily to the Jewish Christians, or was it more from the churches that Paul started?
Well, Paul prevailed. I don't know, and I don't know why that was. I don't know if he was persuasive enough, or if just more of his writings survived, or what, but he prevailed. I'm not always happy about everything that prevailed from Paul, but that's what happened.
Yeah, Paul was certainly the first missionary. The first. He was half Jewish, was a Pharisee, but he somehow caught a hold of this missionary zeal to share the gospel, to share what he had learned. Judaism traditionally is not very mission oriented. They do not proselytize. In fact, it's very difficult for an outsider to come in and to be accepted as Jewish. I think when I took my classes in Judaism, the rabbi told us that if a person who wants to become Jewish has to come to the rabbi 3 times, and the first time they'll be told no. The second time they'll be told no, and it's only the person who persists and asks for the third time, and has had the appropriate training, then is allowed to become Jewish. So they're not an outreach-oriented group, whereas Paul, very very much so was missionary-oriented, and so the church really, moved toward Paul. Now we'll talk here in a minute about are there remnants of the Jerusalem church, but certainly Christianity is. Arlene said, as we know it today, kind of came out of that movement.
You have to remember.
Don't you think that Paul had the missionary thing because of the way he came into the church by his conversion?
That certainly would be a powerful experience. That changed him. I've often thought about the psychology of what happened to Paul. you're a righteous Pharisee and you're going around rooting out these Christian insurgents in different towns. And all of a sudden you have this vision that knocks you down in the middle of the road and causes you to be blind for a period of time. And you meet in visionary form Jesus, who talks to you and kind of tells you, you're on the wrong track and I want you to come and be on my side. I think Paul had a tremendous transformation because of that. I absolutely.
Hey,
Would have
Paul?
led to his
Yeah.
zeal in mission.
Yeah, he had a lot of enthusiasm, and that's probably why. Dennis?
Well, the other big thing that happened, we have to always keep in mind, I think, is the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, and the Romans, when the Jews rebelled in 66 CE, there's a 4-year war there. And then later in the 120 AD or something like that, there was another rebellion. The whole Jewish faith was really racked with a lot of wars and fighting and destruction that had to have some impact on.
Yeah, that certainly could be a reason that Jewish Christianity didn't gain traction as well. I agree.
I'm going to jump in here. I think it's been kind of poked at, but I'm not sure we really said it, but I think it's only because of Paul that we have Christianity, quote unquote, Christianity, because it would have been absorbed into the Jewish religion. And how many non-Jewish people really explore the Jewish traditions and the teachings? We don't usually have that interest in that initiative, but because of it being in the Gentiles also, that's what kept it alive.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think had the Jewish church suppressed Paul and shut down his mission, I think, Christianity would not be the dominant religion that it is today, for sure.
I have one other thought that, if Peter was so convinced that the end was coming, very soon, maybe he was just trying to cover both ends by, going back to the kosher and following some of the teachings he'd always had, just to be on the safe side.
Yeah, I don't know if that was so much Peter. Certainly Paul felt that way. I know he felt like the second coming of Jesus was very imminent, and that's why he was telling people, you don't have time to worry about getting married and having families. We gotta get moving. All right. So Paul felt that Jesus was coming into the world. Paul felt that Jesus, having come into the world, had freed the Gentiles from their obligations to the Mosaic law, and he calls Peter a hypocrite because he had signed on to those ideas and then he later withdrew. Do you agree with that? Was Peter a hypocrite? Peter didn't, certainly. I mean, in spite of the fact that he was the first bishop of Rome, he didn't always have a lot of strength to do what was right the first time around. We saw that with his story at the trial of Jesus, where he denied knowing Jesus, and then now he's being accused by Paul of kind of being a little bit wishy-washy. So Peter had maybe some personal. He was lacking in some personal strengths, I guess.
Hey, Paul.
Anybody? Yes,
yeah, Paul. So I'm wondering if maybe, I don't know that he was convicted to continue to practice those laws, but yet he's preaching to people that practice those laws and were really dedicated to them. So his audience was different. And so maybe he just went that direction because that's the people that he was trying to preach to.
Yeah, I have no doubt that's correct. I mean, that he was trying to do what was expedient, for whichever crowd that he was with. I guess my question was, do you think that's okay, or was Peter wrong?
I don't know the answer to that.
Me either, Marilyn. I don't know a lot of answers, but
Hey, Paul,
I just have lots of questions. Yeah, Dennis.
Yeah.
I'm not going to answer that question, but remember in another letter Paul wrote, he said that he would basically become all things if that's what it took to get somebody on
Yep.
board.
Yeah.
So was that being hypocritical?
It certainly could be argued, I guess. Sometimes we do what's convenient to get through the moment. All right.
It's
So
interesting. It's
go ahead.
interesting though that if that's true about Peter and his preaching, why would he be so critical of Paul? I think that's the thing that's interesting about it.
Yeah. Well, people are human. sometimes we don't always do what we say or do what we think is right. Our behaviors are not always congruent with our belief systems. And it was no different for, these early members of Christianity. I mean, they were flawed. Paul had lots of flaws. Peter had lots of flaws. We have lots of flaws today. We're just kind of all trying to do the best that we can. But sometimes we just have to accept that there's a certain dose of humanity that's involved, and accept that. All right, I was curious as to whether any of these Jewish Christians still were in existence today, so I did a little quick research, and
They're called Messianic Jews.
yeah, let me see if I can get this to come up. Okay, so there are people who identify as Hebrew Christians, and then there are those who identify as the Messianic Jews. I don't think the Hebrew Christians are very prevalent, but there are more of the so-called Messianic Jews. And Messianic Judaism is a religious movement that incorporates elements of Judaism with tenets of Christianity. And many of the people who adhere to this are technically or ethnically Jewish. So here's some of their basic beliefs. They recite Hebrew prayers. They do practice baptism at the age of accountability. I couldn't find what age that was. I think it's probably about the age of 14, which is when they have their bar mitzvahs and bat mitzvahs. They do keep kosher laws. They do observe Saturday as the Sabbath, but they also use the New Testament. So that is a movement that is still in existence. All right.
Can I jump in there?
Sure.
I am reading a wonderful series of fiction by a Messianic Jew named Joel Rosenthal. And if you haven't read his books, they are wonderful. And I just finished a series of 5, and it's talking about the end days. And the very last book ends where the Christians disappear at the rapture. And the ones that are left they're thinking, oh my gosh, he was right, and now I have to go through this. And so a whole bunch of people are being converted at that time, and that's how the book ends. But it was just amazing. And his first book, the guy by profession is had been a journalist, so he knew a lot of the leaders of the world. And he wrote about 9/11 before it happened. And everyone goes, oh, how did you know? And he says, I didn't. I just knew the culture, and I could see it happening. So I'll stop because I know we're short on time. But I just thought, Messianic Jew. So, okay.
Interesting. Yeah, I have a nephew who was a Messianic. He was, we're not Jewish. He's not ethnically Jewish, but he belonged to a Messianic Jewish church somewhere in the Kansas City area for a while. I don't think he does anymore. But I think all that it really did for him was he's got a bunch of tattoos that are in Hebrew. So don't think he practices anymore, though. All right. I was going to ask you for examples. The author talks about an example of how Christians can interpret the Bible in different ways. I'm just going to go ahead and proceed to tell you the story. He talks about, if you've seen the movie Chariots of Fire, which came out some time ago, tells the story of a runner. He was the son of Scottish missionaries to China, and he was good enough to make it into I think it was the 1924 Olympics. And his specialty was the 100-yard dash, the 100-yard run. And he's really good at it. And he was probably going to be the gold medalist. But they decided to hold that event on Sunday. And because he was a devout Christian and he believed that Sunday was the Sabbath, and because the book of Exodus commands that we rest on the Sabbath, he refused to run on that day. But I think what the author points out is, the Sabbath is not really on Sunday. It's technically, according to Exodus, on Saturday. And so, was he using his Christian beliefs to reinterpret the Bible in a way that, probably really wasn't called for? Well, as the movie goes, they found he ran in the 400-meter relay, and I think they won the gold in that. And then I think he ran in one other event that he got the bronze medal. And so he did bring honor at the Olympics, but not in the race that he really was really good at. And actually, Eric Liddell, even though he was Scottish, his parents were Scottish, he is looked upon as China's first Olympic champion because Liddell was born in China. He died in China at a fairly young age as a result of a brain tumor. And so technically he was a Chinese citizen. All right, then Goulder talks about Ignatius, St. Ignatius, and the church at Philadelphia. Ignatius was a Paulist theologian who lived at the end of the 1st century, and he advised the early Christian church to follow the practices of the Apostle Paul. He was executed, I think, maybe as a heretic or something in Rome sometime between 108 and 117 CE. And some of the writings of Ignatius suggest that the Paulist Christians were following an unknown gospel. At that time, the Bible had not been fully written and certainly was not compiled into a canon. And so what Goulder thinks is that this gospel that Ignatius was referring to was actually the book of John. And what he suggests is that, so we have the Gentile Christians who are following the book of John, St. John, and the Jewish Christians were still following the Old Testament. So there's obviously some disconnect there. So he wrote to the church at Philadelphia, which is in Asia Minor, not in Pennsylvania, and he counsels them to reject the Jewish laws and to follow the things that Paul said. And this is what Ignatius wrote to them. If anyone preached the Jewish law unto you, don't listen to him, for it is better to hearken to Christian doctrines from a man who has been circumcised than to Judaism from one who is uncircumcised. But if either of such persons do not speak concerning Jesus Christ, they are, in my judgment, but as monuments and sepulchres of the dead, upon which are written only the names of men. And so the disagreements that we're going to be talking about in this book between Peter and Paul largely occurred between 48 and 64 CE when Paul was executed. And we're going to see that the tension in the early church between the Paulists and the Jewish factions had persisted since this time up until the time of Ignatius. So that tension had been going on. I think the author's point was that tension had been around for at least 69 years. We have Paul preaching both to the Jews and the Gentiles. But I think as Arlene was and Robin were talking about, Paul knew the Gentile mission was not going to be successful if they had to keep the Jewish laws and if they didn't become more missionary minded. And so it does seem that division was inevitable. And so the end result is we have two Christian missions. We have the Jerusalem mission, headed up first by Peter, James, and John, later by other James and Jude. And we have the Paulist mission to Asia Minor and later on to Europe. And even early hatred at times between Jerusalem and the Paulist Christians. And remember too what we learned about the New Testament. Jane or somebody brought up Amy Joel Levine a little bit ago. Remember how she talked about, especially in the book of Luke, a lot of times there were some criticisms leveled at the Jews by these Gentile Christians writing the New Testament that she felt were not well deserved. That the Jews and especially the Pharisees and so forth were far more respected, and Jesus probably would not have talked so disrespectfully about Pharisees and so forth as what Luke and some others have presented. And then Goulder says, also remember the Catholics and Protestants in Ireland. They're all Christians, and yet they were, for a number of years, taken to extreme levels of violence and even terrorism in spite of their common beliefs. So Goulder says that understanding these two missions is going to enhance our understanding of the New Testament, and that's the premise with which he has begun the book. So let's see how we're doing. We're out of time. I had a couple of questions, and this one was, what lines are Christians divided upon in today's world? My thoughts were, we're certainly divided racially in some churches, politically in some churches, culturally or ethnically in some churches, and certainly theologically, differences in our beliefs. We have over 40,000 different varieties of Christianity now. And then I asked, is there a dominant, is any one of these dominant? I'll let you think about that and decide which, if any one of them, is the most important. And then my last question was going to be, why is there so much religious intolerance in the world?
I had a real quick comment. I just wonder if a lot of Peter's situation, since he was in the Jerusalem area, was politically bound by what was going on in the area at that time, more so than Paul.
Yeah, it could be. I mean, the Jews were oppressed by the Roman Empire, and certainly I think they would have seen Gentiles living in Asia Minor and certainly in the seat of the empire at Rome as enemies. And here you're trying to bring two groups of people together who are enemies and help them to find some commonality in religion. So there certainly were, political differences, certainly ethnic differences between Jews and Gentiles. And then if you look at their backgrounds theologically, very diverse, very different. So anyway, so the final conclusion is we have this new so-called perfect religion that Luke wants to present in the book of Acts, but Goulder says it wasn't so perfect. There were differences between the factions even at the very beginning.
Thank you, Paul. Good class.
All right. Yeah, thank you. So next week we're going to talk about chapter 2. I'm not sure who's teaching. It's called The Loyalty Test, Jesus' Family, and the Sons of Zebedee. So we'll see you next week.
Thank you, Paul.
You're welcome.
What's the exact name of the book?
It's St. Paul versus St. Peter, A Tale of Two Missions.
So are you going to ever tell us the answer to the question that you had?
Which one?
The very final question that you had, is there a dominant difference? Is that what it was?
That's your opinion. You can look at those four differences. I think the world is largely still divided along racial and ethnic lines and cultural lines. So for me, that would be my answer. But you might think that it's political. You might think it's something else. So I don't have the right answer. I just have my answer.
Yeah,
Well, I would add one more. You have economic differences too.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
I'm teaching next week, and chapter 2 is only 8 pages long, so surely you can get it read.